Hello and welcome to our Ask Me Anything session today for our Irius Risk Threat Modelling tool. I'm very pleased to share that James Rabe, our Senior Solution Architect and Global Technical Program Manager, is a subject matter expert on threat modelling practices and, of course, on Irius Risk. He's often found speaking at local OWASP events and submitting call for papers to encourage secure by design best practices. So today, James is on hand to answer all your questions. Perhaps you're wondering how to utilize role-based access control, or you're curious how to encourage further team adoption. We're all ears and we'll give you as much information as we can. Please use the Q&A function if you're happy for your queries to be visible to others, but otherwise feel free to send me a direct message in the chat. James, perhaps you can set the scene with some commonly asked questions you receive while I go ahead and start checking the Q&A.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Claire. So one of the changes that I think we've gotten asked about quite frequently is around the new issue tracker profiles functions. So let me know, Claire, you can see my screen, right? Serious risk pulled up here.
I can indeed. Looks great.
Cool. So I've just got a fresh tenant here. One of the most frequent questions we get is, okay, why did we migrate away from the current issue trackers, to the new issue tracker profiles? Now, one of the common feedback items we received is, okay, so if I've gone and created an issue tracker profile for each individual threat model, but let's say, for example, I need to go and update those settings now. How do I do that for multiple threat models or at multiple different levels throughout Irius Risk, right? How do I make that change much faster? How do I sustain that change, or even how do I allow a user to make a change to an issue tracker profile without needing to give out credential access to them? Well, that's where issue tracker profiles come into play, because now I have the ability to go into my control panel and I can go into issue trackers. Now I can define an issue tracker profile without any of my users needing to necessarily know like what kind of permissions that requires, what kind of board information is required. All they need to know is that I've got a name of an issue tracker profile, and I can go through and select that profile now, and I can deploy that anywhere inside of Irius Risk I have permission to. That also means that I have to go through and I can update one profile, and then that profile is then going to trickle down to anywhere that's used. So if I need to add a new custom field or a new field mapping into that profile, I can go in and add that, and then that's going to trickle down into all of the different projects and all the different areas it's being used at without needing to go touch each and every single one of those issue tracker locations. So, should provide some additional value, because you can imagine if you've got several thousand projects inside of Irius Risk, that can be quite a painful process to have to go through and update each of those individually. So should be valuable for many of our users.
Definitely. So you can do, you could upload in bulk and to those issue trackers that were displayed on the screen. So you could have a whole variety. Perhaps there's one team using CA Rally, another on Jira, and then you can do a bulk action.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's one of the nice things about this is obviously like here, I've just got a new issue tracker profile for Jira, but I could have one that's the default for Jira. I could also have ones that are the default for certain teams. And I have the ability to go through and grab those, from the drop down. So instead of having to, go through and recreate those with each level, you just go through and select one that's been previously done once. So it has that set once, deploy many configuration setting. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And that's two way, isn't it, as well? So once an action is taken in, say, Jira, and a ticket is closed, that comes back over into Irius Risk.
Yeah, it's a bi-directional flow. So as I'm updating the issue, so once I've created a thread, that thread has a countermeasure. I can then send either of those items into my issue tracker, and then as I update them inside of my issue tracker, such as comments will sync bi-directionally from both, but it's going to preserve that issue tracker as my single source of truth. So as I work that item inside of Jira, inside of ServiceNow, once I close it out, it's then going to sync that status back into Irius Risk, close out my countermeasure, which is then going to reduce my risk, hopefully to an acceptable level, depending on how many controls we have attached to it at that given time.
Awesome, thank you. I was having a look actually the other day because we were aware of the threats and countermeasures, and it seems that at a component level, you can do the same with the issue tracker integration. So if there's a specific component aligned to a certain team, that you can do it at that level too. Wonder if you could show us that as well, please.
Yeah, so for example, I can define a project here. So if I go
Oh,
into issue
amazing.
trackers, I can do a different issue tracker per project. And you see, I don't have one configured at the moment. But if I go into a threat model, I could also go in and grab a specific component on here. And I could say, maybe I have a separate team that is managing my firewall services or web application firewall services. I could then say, I want that team to have a specific configuration. So I could even define within my threat model, front end team, back end team, particular persona based team. I could send different tickets to different boards based on their location within my threat model. And then not only do I have the ability to do it per component, this is functionality we had previously, but I can also do it per threat, per weakness, per countermeasure. So depending on the exact proper audience for that individual work item, I can send that to the correct team, regardless of where they are in the ecosystem.
Brilliant, thank you. Perhaps now then would be a good time to talk about role-based access control. Just thinking, because we're talking about what different teams need and how we can align threats, countermeasures, and so on. What is capable within the tool that can be used?
Yeah, so within Erius Risk, we are an RBAC based product, right? So within Erius Risk, you can either manage authentication locally or you can integrate it with your identity provider. If you are mapping roles or groups from your identity provider, you can map those directly into roles inside of Erius Risk. And then based on that role, we can assign sets of permissions both outside of the threat model, what we call the global level, as well as permissions at the project level within our threat model. We also have the ability to place you based on your role or group membership from your IDP into business units inside of Erius Risk. Those business units are then going to be used to control collaboration and visibility into your threat model or into groups of threat models assigned by your business unit or assigned by your department. So just to show you an example of that, if I go into users or if I go into permissions here, once I go into permissions, I'll be able to see my roles. And you see I've got several different roles in here. So I can map, and these are just the defaults. The ones we see used most frequently are our full access user, our developer, and our role admin. Most of the time when a customer is setting up their tenant for the first time, they'll go through and clone these. That way you have the tenant default, and then you have your version of that. That way, if we make a change, it doesn't unintentionally make a change to one of your permission sets. And then once they have those, they'll go through and map groups of users to these different roles. You can also set it up so that you have a default role. So for example, you can make it so that when someone comes in, they only have read-only access. So they only have the ability to be a test user inside of Erius Risk. And that's a default role. So if they weren't included in one of your higher level access groups, you can default them to a role. We can also have that person automatically placed into business units. And remember, business units are going to control what we have access to from a visibility or collaboration standpoint inside of Erius Risk. So imagine I've come in, I've created a threat model. When I create the threat model, I'm the default owner. But if I want Claire to come in and threat model with me, by default, she can't see that threat model. So I have to add her as an owner on that threat model with me. Or, imagine I've got Claire and a team of other 50 developers I want to bring in. Instead of adding each one individually, I can add that business unit or that group of users, and that's going to bring all 50 of them into my threat model all at the same time. So I don't have to worry about going through and adding each user one by one. I can add all of them at the same time, which is a nice time saver, because you can imagine that can be quite expensive from a time perspective.
Yes, definitely, especially with larger teams. Perhaps then, what about how can we notify team members of a threat, or, how can we send notifications to individuals on actions that are required?
Yeah, so we could send notifications to them. The rules engine does support the ability to send notifications. So if I go into our rules editor, and we're going to go over into our workflow rules. If I go ahead and select new rule, you're going to see an action inside of here that says notify user by email. And we actually have customers that are doing this through a couple different mechanisms. Mechanism number one is the workflow rule editor, where based on some condition, so answer selected on questionnaires, whether or not the architecture questionnaire is completed, custom field status, project creation, all of these different triggers can be used to then send an email externally. We also have other customers that will use like webhook integrations through a product like Zapier to query certain details from the API. So anytime a license is used, anytime you hit a certain quantity, anytime a certain threat is created, anytime a user is assigned to a threat, and then using Zapier, it'll actually grab that webhook and then it'll post inside of Slack. It'll send you a Teams notification. So it just kind of depends on what the use case is, but there are some pretty flexible options for notifications from Arius Risk.
Sounds good. And we have had a question. We knew this was going to come up. What is Arius Risk's approach to threat modeling AI?
Yeah, that's a great question and a frequently asked one. So at the moment, and I know AI is there is the rush to include AI in everything. The Arius Risk has been quite deliberate to not rush an AI integration into our product, just given the nature of what we work with. Threat modeling data is very sensitive and should be taken, security of that should be taken very seriously. To that end, we do have the ability, number one, the ability to threat model AI products inside of Arius Risk. So let me just open up a threat model here real quick and we'll look at that library. So inside of your diagram of any given threat model, you will notice that you have a category called AI ML threats. Pardon my yawn. And then we have the ability to model different AI systems, such as GPTs or other AI integrations. So like number one, we want to make sure that teams that are working on integrating AI into their systems have the ability to threat model those prior to building them, right? Because obviously that's the best time to threat model something like an AI integration would be prior to actually turning it on. So you have the ability to integrate that into your system by using our AI ML library inside of Arius Risk. And then coming shortly will be, I think we've named him AI Jeff inside of Arius Risk, which will allow you to interact with AI to help build a threat model inside of Arius Risk. So I can provide Jeff with unstructured content, such as, if I've had a team meeting and I want to dump in a bunch of notes about the functional requirements of an application, I can dump those into Slack and then it will start to build my threat model for me. And then just, periodically querying, am I doing a good job? Is this what you're expecting? Is this the final output that you're looking for? And it'll actually go and build this from scratch. I mean, it's pretty incredible. We've actually seen some quite interesting scenarios being threat modeled with Jeff. I think Claire, what was one of the ones that you saw it go through and try?
There was threat modeling a zoo, which is
Threat
obviously
modeling a
quite
zoo.
niche, and it
Yeah.
did actually add in related components that were in Arius Risk, and it identified what was needed. And then there were some others that were just a bit daft, but it still managed to do them and create the diagram, which was pretty cool. And
So
then you can share and collaborate further, of course.
Yeah, well, and then the first thing I try to do when I get a new toy is try to break it. So I think I saw some people threat modeling a cup of tea. And the nice thing about Jeff is that you do have the ability to customize it kind of within that session. So I think at one point I actually got Jeff to reply back to me with rap lyrics as a part of my process, so he would have a little more fun with me during the conversation. And it's pretty cool, what it's been able to do in such a short period of time. So the ability to just ingest different types of content, so you don't have to we don't need a really polished prompt for it. It can take in all kinds of content, and then whether it's a JSON or XML or an SBOM, I think I've even seen it'll take that and build a threat model from it, so that I'm not having to go through and massage and make this content all nice and pretty. It'll then give me a nice JSON output and then build the threat model for me inside of Irius Risk. That way I've got just good representation without having to spend a lot of time nurturing that content.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so
Testing's going well.
definitely, yeah, definitely a frequent point of conversation, and I know we're going to see more from Jeff here in the near future.
For sure. We'll share a link actually to a demo video in the chat in a
Cool.
moment, and then anyone can take a look as well. So what other questions have we got here? So how can I remove threats from my model if I need to? I mean, I'm not sure why. I don't know if you can think of a UK use case where that's needed, unless it's maybe out of scope with a third party, but there was a prior question that asked this. So we obviously have to tread carefully with our answer because the threat is identified for a reason.
Yeah, so I can think of probably 3 scenarios where I might want to remove a threat from a project. Of those 3 scenarios, right? Scenario 1, I have the concept of a threat is not applicable. Okay, so I've created a threat model, and I've got let's say, for example, I've got a server that's inside of a trusted private zone versus a public cloud, and I have some threats that may be applicable in a public cloud, but not in a trusted private secured zone. Okay, so doesn't really make sense to move any countermeasures to being implemented because the threat just doesn't apply. So, like looking at this threat model, for example, if I go over into my threats interface and I go in and I'm just going to go ahead and open up, auto expand my threats here, I could go through and say, I've got this particular threat. This isn't applicable for my threat model. So I can go up and select my, I can actually come over here on the right side, I'm sorry. And I can go over and I can move this to not applicable. Okay, which it's then going to prompt me for a reason, and I'm going to say, this is in a trusted zone. Tabbed out of it. Trusted zone. This is NA for this model, right? And then once I select not applicable, it's going to provide that response to all of my subsequent reporting. Now, the threat's not gone. It's not into the ether. It's just kind of hidden, right? It's still on my threat model, and I can actually go back and I can unhide my NA threats. So right now it's hidden, but if I unselect hide NA threats, it's going to bring that back into my threat model, so I can see it inside of here. Okay, so you can see that I have an NA countermeasure progress, and I can see that it's a risk of very low, right? Because it's an NA threat. Situation number 2. So situation number 1 is I have the threat, but it's not applicable in the scenario. Situation number 2 is maybe I've made a mistake. I've made a whoopsie, and I need to remove a threat. Now, by design, threats are meant to be a bit sticky because we don't just want people to go through and delete them. So if I go over here on the right side, you're going to notice I don't have the ability to delete it natively. Okay, so you need an administrator to enable this, but if I leave my threat model and go back to my control panel, so if I click the button and go back to my settings, so go into features, and we're going to see allow delete threat is turned off here. If I enable that, select save changes, and then now I go back to projects, view all projects, go into my threat model, go into my threats. And now if I were to select one of my threats, now I have the ability to delete that risk and countermeasure, right? And remember, even if we give that permission to the tenant as a whole, we'll still want to restrict it based on the role, because it's probably not something we want to give out to everyone. Because what's the fastest way to reduce risk in a threat model? Delete all the threats, right? And we can be very, very fast, very, very quick. A situation where I probably would not want to delete a threat under any circumstances is, and this is sometimes where someone says, well, that threat doesn't exist because I've got a countermeasure for it. Well, the threat does exist, but you've mitigated that threat over time. And that's where I would say, like, leave the threat, just move the countermeasure to implement it, or auto implement that countermeasure using the rules engine, because you still have that threat. So, like, let's say I'm a compliance person or an auditor, or third party audit, and I'm coming in and I want to know where are all these other threats, and you go, well, they've already been taken care of. Well, that's not really what I asked. I want to know, like, what's the consideration on this given threat model. I don't want to hear you just deleted them, because what if that threat changes, or that threat evolves, or that countermeasure falls off? Who's testing it? Who's verifying it? And that's when I might want to actually have that threat on there. Now, that's scenario one. Is it's not applicable. Scenario two is I made a whoopsie and I want to actually delete it. Scenario three is, well, what if my diagram changes and that threat's just really not even just in scope any longer? I don't want to have to go through and delete every single one. And this is where I have a project setting. And if I go into features within my project, you're going to notice I have this setting here called automatically remove threats and countermeasures that no longer apply. And the use case that I most frequently use here is, like, you guys remember on my diagram how I had the WAF all the way on the left, and then I had the VPC EC2 instance. Let's say I just remove the WAF from my diagram, so it's not really in scope for the threat modeling longer. By default, I'm still going to have the threats associated with that. And the reason is because, let's say I had something on my diagram originally, we threat modeled it, and then I've implemented those countermeasures, and that went to audit. They reviewed it, it came back, and then now I've iterated, I've made another version. I don't want to maybe lose the legacy information on my threat model, so it stays on there even if I change the diagram. But if I didn't want it to, I could go through and enable this setting, and then as I change items on my diagram, either by answering questions or by, removing functionality on my diagram. So if I then go through and delete that component and just say, now I'm going to connect directly to my EC2 or to my load balancer and update my threat model, now anything associated with that WAF is automatically going to be removed from my diagram, because, or from my threat model, because it was removed from my diagram. And this would also apply to, like, any questionnaires. So if you had a set of threats introduced because you said, TLS is not used, so I'm sending data in plain text over the interwebs, right? Because of that, you're going to get a set of threats. But if you went through and said, well, now I'm using TLS, it would automatically remove those threats that were added previously. Now, again, I would say that's a better case for auto implementing something versus removing it, but to each his own. So those are kind of the three scenarios, Claire, that I would see and have seen most frequently for how we treat threats that aren't applicable. My preference is always to NA them over delete them, because if someone said, well, why didn't you consider that threat? I don't know about you guys, but if I delete them all, I'm not going to remember why I did that. If they're NA, I had to provide a response, so I have at least an audit trail of that.
Exactly. Put my anxiety at rest. Thank you. People just going and deleting threats. It's good that there are measures in place to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, that is the fastest way to be done. I don't have any threats. They're all gone. Perfect.
Yeah. I did see when you were navigating around the export option, what file types, what options are available if someone needs to export out of Irius Risk.
Yeah, so we've got a couple options. Inside of the UI, I can export all of my threats and countermeasures into XLS, or to an Excel spreadsheet format. We also have the ability to export the full project. And this is something that I think is pretty standard. I know other threat modeling companies don't offer this, and I don't really understand why it's acceptable to hold people's data captive. But for example, you can also export the data model, which is going to provide you with an XML of your project structure. I mean, it's your data. I'm not sure why you shouldn't be able to have access to it. You also have the ability to access it through the API. So if you need to programmatically call your project and grab data and filter data from that project on some periodic basis, you can go through and export that. And again, like this export data model here is going to be XML based. If you're doing it through the API, it'll be JSON based. So you'll have the ability to get different formats from different sources depending on what your specific need is on that given item. Does that answer the question, Claire?
Does indeed, thank you.
Okay.
It takes us nicely onto an import question where someone said, can I import a UML diagram?
Okay. So depending on the format you're looking to bring in, Irius Risk does support integration into an open source standard called OTM. It's the Open Threat Model format. Irius Risk has created parsers that will take different types of formats, like for example, Visio or Draw.io or Terraform, CloudFormation, Lucidcharts. We can take those formats, and with the parsers that have been built, they can convert that into OTM, and then that OTM can be brought into Irius Risk. That actually reminds me, we have a new parser that is coming out with Abacus, which is another enterprise architecture product that will allow, basically, you can call the Abacus API, pull down a copy of your diagram, and be able to create your threat model from it, so that engineers aren't having to, okay, I made it over here, and then I got to go re-diagram it over here. It starts to remove some of that non-value added time from that threat modeling process. I don't think we directly support the UML format, but again, it depends on kind of what you're modeling that in. If you're modeling that inside of Draw.io, you could absolutely bring it in, through that format. But so hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. We can also pass in cloud orchestration tools, can't we?
Yeah,
in case that's
yeah,
useful
correct.
for people to know.
So Terraform, CloudFormation, Terraform Plan. So those are all supported formats for bringing in through the API through OTM. And that's going to actually allow you to build your full threat model. So it'll notice that, especially with Terraform, that you're referencing an EC2 instance. That'll be translated into an EC2 instance inside of Irius Risk. That way, you don't have to go through and remap or rediagram, allowing you to model your cloud infrastructure based on, a live representation to generate that plan file.
Yep, sounds good. And then what training or onboarding is offered?
Okay.
Quite an open question.
Yeah. So from a training perspective, when you are, so as a customer who's coming in, I guess from a couple of different perspectives, you can either be a new customer. A new customer would go through the Irius Risk onboarding process. We offer several live sessions for that, and really there's not a strict cap on those. Depending on your process, the onboarding gets structured to kind of match that process. If you are an existing customer and you need ongoing training, we do make our SA team available to you. So if something has changed in your business, or if you've got a new feature you want to explore, or just have general questions, regarding threat modeling or how it's done inside Irius Risk, our SA teams and SAs and engineers are available for those questions on an ongoing basis. If live sessions really aren't your thing, if you like working, late at night after business hours doing computer-based training, we do have 4 courses currently available, and that's going to be at learn.iriusrisk.com. We have one called the De-Risker certification, which is an end-to-end program for building threat models and reducing risk. We have a diagramming champion one, which is a narrower session, which focuses specifically on trust zones and diagramming and why all of those components tie together to make a great threat model. We have an administrator training, which is about configuration and deployment of our tool. And then lastly, we have a partner training, which is for our ecosystem partners, which help us deploy and help provide threat modeling consultant, which is more based for them, but it is available if people would like to sit through it.
Awesome, thank you. Very comprehensive. Definitely get the De-Risker certification. Loads of people have done it now. It's about 400.
And the best part about it, Claire, is you get free certification swag for your LinkedIn page. So there's a nice little cert that comes with it. Very pretty graphics, not made by me. They would be drawn with crayon and paper if I were doing it, but they look great.
True. The digital badge is pretty neat, isn't it?
Very
On the
nice.
certificate.
They're very nice. Yeah.
So we are at the 30-minute point now. So we are going to wrap up the session. If this was useful, let us know, or even let your customer success manager know, and we can set up further ones. James, thank you very much for all of your insights as usual, and we'll see you all again very soon.
Cool. Thanks, Claire. Have a great day, everyone.